Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you might think. On the night of March 3, 1852, in the bustling city of New York, the people of the town raided the house of a man named Jeremiah Quinn. He was beaten and dragged out by the angry mob to be hanged from a tree in the middle of town. But just as the noose tightened around his neck, the police arrived and pulled him from the mob's grasp. As he was held in a dimly lit cell at the station, the lead officer asked, "Why did the townsfolk want you dead?" "You should have let them kill me. I have nothing to live for," Jeremiah replied, his voice heavy with despair. I had never been more excited than when the midwife told me my wife was pregnant. We had been married for over 15 years. This was her third pregnancy, and it was already 4 months along. She had always miscarried before the end of the second month, but this pregnancy was already in its second trimester. I can still remember the look on my wife's face that day. She had never looked more excited. She would hum a tune while going about her chores, and despite my pleas for her to rest, she stubbornly insisted she was strong enough to do everything she had done before. And so, I let her. Every day I watched as our child grew in her belly. She looked rounder and even more beautiful. But one night, everything changed. I woke up to a shrill scream. My wife was holding her belly, groaning in pain. I hurriedly took her in the carriage to the infirmary. The midwives rushed her into the emergency ward, while I paced anxiously for what felt like an eternity outside. When someone finally emerged, they confirmed my worst fear. We had lost the child. After that day, the light seemed to fade from her eyes, and she became cold and distant once more, just as she had after her previous losses. She only came outside when she needed to get stuff from the market. But after a few months, everything went back to how it used to be. We agreed to take our minds off the incident and focus on ourselves together. For a while, it felt as though happiness had returned. A year had passed since our loss, and we still had no child. One evening, my wife came home from a function in town with an unusual question, something she had never brought up in our many years together. That day, she asked, "Why don't we adopt a child from the orphanage home?" I hadn't really considered adopting a child before, as I still held on to the hope of having our own someday. So, I told her I wasn't sure about it and that we should hold on for a while. We didn't speak of it for a few days, but the thought kept ringing in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't such a bad idea after all. Eventually, the prospect of giving a child a loving home began to outweigh my fears. Finally, I agreed, and we set a weekend to visit the orphanage in town. As the day drew closer, I felt the anxiousness growing within us. My wife really wanted this, and I wanted it to work so she would finally be happy. We would adopt a beautiful baby girl and take care of her together. I still remember the day we walked into the orphanage. Grace squeezed my hand tightly as we made our way to the head nun's office. The head nun welcomed us warmly, and we shared all our needs, down to the specifics for the child we had come to adopt. She led us to a small room where the infants lay in their cribs. I noticed a small boy sitting alone in a corner, and my wife saw him too. He was about 6 years old and looked sad. The nun told us his name was Tommy, and his parents had passed away 3 years ago. Grace seemed drawn to him. Her gaze lingered with pity, and an emotion I couldn't quite grasp. She walked closer to him, but he turned away when he noticed her approaching. She asked the nun about him, and the nun explained that Tommy was a quiet child, often withdrawn, and never playing with the other kids. We continued to the nursery, where we met the adorable babies, each more precious than the last. Grace looked at me, and I could sense her struggle. Her usual decisiveness had somehow vanished. I, on the other hand, was certain. I had my heart set on a little girl, a tiny bundle of joy to fill our home. I pointed to a 3-month-old baby girl with big bright eyes and a sweet smile. "She's perfect," I said to Grace. "Yeah, she is, but I don't know." I thought we already agreed on what we wanted. "Why the uncertainty?" I said to her, but she didn't respond. She just had a distant look in her eyes. Sensing the tension, the nun suggested that we go home and think about our decision. When we got to the carriage, I tried to talk to her about it, but she was unresponsive. I couldn't understand what had come over her. She had always been so practical and focused on the future. Now she seemed drawn to the past, to a child who was already 6 years old. I couldn't resist asking her about it when we finally arrived home. "Why did you hesitate back there, Grace? You seemed so unsure." She turned to me, and when I stared into her eyes, I saw a strange intensity. "I know we wanted a baby, Jeremiah, but I think we should adopt an older child. Someone between 3 and 5, perhaps." I was taken aback. "An older child? But why?" I asked. "Because I saw that little boy sitting alone in the corner. He's been in the orphanage for 3 years. No one has come for him. I feel a connection to him, Jeremiah. I think he needs us." Hearing those words tore at my heart. I had my hopes set on a baby, a new life to nurture and love. However, Grace's plea planted a seed of doubt in my mind. I couldn't ignore the image of that lonely boy. We argued about it for hours. In the end, we went to bed, feeling utterly exhausted. The following day, as we prepared to return to the orphanage, I woke up with newfound clarity. I realized that Grace was right. Adopting Tommy wasn't just about charity. It was about giving a child a chance at a real family. With that in mind, I gradually let go of the idea of adopting a baby and focused on the boy who truly needed us. When we arrived at the orphanage, we approached the head nun. I still recall the way her face lit up when we told her of our decision to take Tommy. She led us to the room where he was playing. As we watched him, I saw the same sadness in his eyes that Grace had noticed earlier. From that day forward, Tommy became a part of our family. At first, he was quiet, almost too quiet. I often found myself wondering what thoughts lay behind his solemn gaze. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to make friends with the neighbors' kids. We showered him with love and care, for he was everything we had ever wanted: sweet, obedient, and full of potential. Then, one day something happened. Grace went to the market, leaving me alone with Tommy. While I was tinkering in the workshop, I heard a child crying. When I stepped outside, I saw the neighbor's child, tears streaming down his face. He pointed at Tommy, who stood nearby watching us. The boy claimed that Tommy had broken his toy after he refused to let him play with it. I couldn't believe it. It didn't sound like Tommy. I questioned him, and he offered a different version of the story, admitting that he had accidentally stepped on the toy. I apologized to the neighbor, but the damage was done. When Grace returned, she was shocked and disappointed by what had happened. Together we scolded Tommy, explaining the importance of respecting others' belongings. The next day we took him to the neighbor's house to apologize again. A few days later, a terrible thing occurred. The neighbor's child fell ill, strange lumps appearing on his face. The sickness quickly spread to the child's mother, and soon both were gone. Fear gripped the neighborhood, and I was terrified. The thought of losing Tommy and Grace was unbearable. I knew we had to leave to escape whatever contagious illness had befallen our neighbors. So we packed our belongings and fled to another part of New York. I thought it was all over, but I was wrong. That was just the beginning of something else I had no idea about. On this particular day, we were sitting at the dinner table, the warm aroma of roasted chicken and fresh salad filling the air. Tommy, as always, was eager to dig in. "Just a moment, Tommy. Let's say a prayer first," Grace said gently, her hands clasped together. Tommy paused, his fork hovering over his plate. A strange look crossed his face. I couldn't quite discern his thoughts, but he certainly didn't look pleased with her request. "Why do we have to do that?" he asked, his tone slightly defiant. "Because we want to thank God for the food," I explained. "It's a way of showing our gratitude." Tommy stared at me with an unfocused gaze, and then, without another word, he got up from the table and walked away. I called out to him, urging him to return, but his response shocked me. He simply turned to me and said, "I'm not hungry," before walking back to his room. Grace and I exchanged concerned looks. Tommy had never behaved like that before. He was always eager to eat, especially when Grace cooked. We finished our dinner in silence, with an uneasy tension hanging in the air. After cleaning up, we went to check on Tommy. He was lying in bed, his back turned to us. We tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. Even after Grace tucked him in, he remained uncommunicative. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something was wrong. Days passed, and his behavior felt increasingly off. I attempted to discuss it with Grace, but she always brushed it off as typical childish behavior. One night, I was awakened by a strange noise, a low, guttural sound coming from Tommy's room. I sat up. Grace was still fast asleep beside me. Grabbing the oil lamp from the bedside table, I crept out of bed and tiptoed towards his room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and peered inside, but the room was empty. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't know where he could have gone. I hurried to the window and looked outside but saw no one. Just as I stepped toward the lobby, I found the front door wide open. It was shocking because I never forgot to lock the main door. Panic surged through me as I rushed outside, calling out Tommy's name. The night was dark and silent. I scanned the street, straining my eyes to see in the dim light of the lamp. Then I saw him. Tommy was standing still a few houses down, staring up at the sky. I approached him cautiously, calling his name. As he turned around, what I saw was not only unusual, but terrifying. His eyes were pitch black, devoid of any life or emotion. Confusion gripped me. I didn't understand what was happening. I gently grabbed him, and he fell into my arms, his eyes shut as if he were asleep. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The following day, I told Grace about what had happened. She listened patiently but dismissed it as a case of sleepwalking, claiming that kids did it all the time. But I knew it wasn't nothing. Something was deeply wrong, though I didn't yet understand what it was. When I talked to Tommy about that night, he claimed he had no idea what had happened. One evening, while I was reading a book in the living room, I suddenly heard a soft voice, a child's voice, coming from Tommy's room. I got up to check what was going on. Tommy was sitting on his bed, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. He was talking. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. "Who are you talking to, Tommy?" I asked. He turned to me with a strange glint in his eyes. "No one," he replied. I tried to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and disturbing. He often stared into space with a vacant expression, sometimes speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Grace noticed this too, and we agreed it was time to take him to see the priest. But on the day we were set to go, Grace suddenly fell weak, and I rushed her to the infirmary. When she came out, we were told that we were expecting. We had never been happier. After so long, we didn't think we would ever conceive again. With this joyful news, we forgot about our appointment with the priest. One day I returned home with a brown dog for Grace. She had always wanted a pet, and it felt like the perfect time to give her something special. After a few days, one evening, Grace called the dog a bad dog because it had bitten her shoe. The next morning, when we woke up, we couldn't find the dog anywhere. Nor could we find Tommy until I went to the back of the house. There, I stumbled upon the most horrifying sight I had ever seen. Blood was everywhere, and the dog's body lay near bloodied scissors. Its head had been ripped off, and Tommy stood over it with a shovel, having already dug a hole to bury it. I didn't want to tell Grace what I had seen, but she had already come up behind me. When I asked Tommy why he had done that, he simply said, "The dog sees things. It deserved to die." Grace, already terrified, lashed out at Tommy. Just then a fierce wind blew through, lifting a stake from the ground. It flew past Grace's head and pierced the wall with a thud. I had never witnessed such a strong wind in our neighborhood. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. It was what Tommy said next that chilled me to the bone. "The next one will be on your head." My lips felt suddenly dry. That night, Grace suggested we take Tommy back to the church to see the priest. I agreed, but the following day, Grace fell ill. I wanted to take her to the hospital, but Tommy insisted on coming with us. Unease gripped me, so I told him to stay home, but as I tried to leave, the door slammed shut. It was as if Tommy had done it with his eyes. Grace and I were shaking, unable to believe what was happening. I moved towards the door, but it felt as though an invisible force held me still. Suddenly, the entire house began to shake, as if an earthquake were happening. Grace continued to wail, the pain becoming unbearable as blood dripped down her legs. All I wanted was to take my wife to the hospital, but instead, Tommy began to laugh. It didn't sound like his voice anymore. Then he uttered the horrifying words that still echo in my mind. "Your child was gone the day she conceived. Now, I'm going to take her too." I didn't comprehend the full meaning of those words until Grace stopped moving. I began to cry, feeling more helpless than ever. I couldn't believe my wife was gone until she lay cold in my arms, our baby still in her belly. I turned to Tommy, but he was no longer the child I had loved and cherished. His eyes glowed an unnatural red. A dark, shadowy figure hovered above him, shifting and changing in the dim light. At that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. Tommy wasn't a human child. He was something else, something dark and evil. The next moment, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone, but the cold body of my wife still lay in my arms. A chilling silence enveloped me until I heard the distant voice of an angry mob gathering outside my door. Word had spread that I never treated Tommy as my son, and that was why I killed my wife when she tried to stop me from hurting him. I couldn't comprehend how such lies had circulated or who had spread them. Desperately, I tried to explain the truth to them. "You don't understand. He wasn't what he seemed," I shouted, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. It was as if the rumors had taken hold of their minds, binding them to a narrative that painted me as a monster. After Jeremiah finished telling his story, the authorities launched an investigation. However, Tommy was not listed among the children at the orphanage, and neither Jeremiah's name nor his wife's appeared on the registry of adopters. It was as if they had never been there at all. With no evidence to support his claims, the case was eventually closed. The townsfolk were left to believe that Jeremiah was a deranged man who had murdered his pregnant wife. You've made it, for now. Thank you for joining on this horrifying journey. If you want more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and to follow on other platforms. There are many more stories to come, and if you enjoyed this, please like the video. It really helps. Let me know your favorite part or any suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.